Perfect. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Stuart Blumenthal with ETHOSystems. I am the practice director here for the Intacct practice. And what we're going to be going over today is some really cool tips and tricks on financial statement training and tips, or financial training. Just for a little bit of information here, this webinar is being recorded. It will last about 30 to 45 minutes. All the phone lines are muted, so please use the questions feature within the GoToWebinar to ask everything. Also, just to make sure that everyone understands, this is not to teach you how to create a financial statement right from start to finish, but it's to teach you some of the tips and tricks about creating financial statements within Intacct, because there's so much you can do with it, especially around dimensions and projects. The way they look, the way they drill down, and even the ability to export them out. There's so many things you can do with it, and they have to be absolutely right, because if you mess up on a financial statement, no one is happy. So with that, I'm going to go over our 7 tips and tricks that we have, and then kind of go over a little bit within the product itself. So the first thing that we want to talk about is tip number 1 is using account groups and categories. Now, this is so important. When you're setting up your financial statements, you always want to make sure that each account is tied to a category. These categories are set up within Intacct, and they basically, you could take categories and then move them into your account group, which those account groups can then show up on your financial reports. Now, when you're setting up Intacct for the first time, you can use something called the Quick Start program, which helps you set all this up ahead of time. So it helps you when you set up your financial statements. It will provide you the categories automatically. So when you're setting up a GL account, what you want to do is that you'll see something called Quick Start category. Now, people go, well, I'm not using you might not be using a Quick Start program, but what you want to still do is still put that category in there. So again, make sure that your category is there. Now, if you want to check to make sure all your GL accounts have a category associated to them, there's a couple things you can do. The first thing you can do is modify your list in Intacct. So for example, I went into my accounts here and I created I modified the list to show the Quick Start category. It was very easy to do that. In fact, our next training in November, we're going to be showing you how to modify list views within Intacct as a better reporting tool. So we'll be going over that in our next training. The other option that you can do is use something called Smart Rules. For those who are not familiar with Smart Rules allow you to change some of the logic that occurs within Intacct and allows you to create alerts or things that happen to make sure your data is entered in right, or things happen after something has been entered into the system. One of the greatest Smart Rules you can use is you can make fields required in Sage Intacct. So for example, I went into the system here and I said, give me a type of an error. Now I could also have done a warning, but I chose error so they would not save the record at that point. And I said, whenever you add or set or make a change to a GL account, if the category is blank, so you can see I put there's a little button on the right-hand side that would say add a field. But if I said the category is not equal to, and the way you do that is an exclamation mark and an equal sign, and then you put quotes around it, blank, then it's going to say, please enter a category, so I can enter the error message. These are great features to use within the product, and if you do have any questions on Smart Rules, our team can definitely help you out with that. One of the last tips we will also, in terms of for account groups and categories, is that when you're setting up your account groups, now account groups can be done 2 different ways. They can be done based upon categories. We were just talking about those Quick Start categories, or they can be ranges. Now, one of the things that a lot of people do is they'll put in a starting account number and an ending account number for accounts that already exist in the system. So for example, in my system, for example, let me just bring up this little area and I'll just show you in person here. A lot of times if you set up an account group, for example, and I said, hey, let's create a new account group. And I do this one, I'm going to call this test 2. And I might go from this account to this account. People will add that as a range. But instead, what's better to do is take this away and simply just put in 1099. Like, for example, if it's an entire range, put the entire range in afterwards, because what that will allow us to do is that if you add an account after that last one on the list, then it will definitely show up in the future. So in case you accidentally use account groups based upon accounts itself instead of categories, make sure it's the full range. It'll definitely keep your life easier long term when you're running your reports. Because again, if you miss one account, a brand new account, it might cause your balance sheet to be out of balance, or you might not be able to recognize all your income correctly or expenses. The second tip that we were going to go over today is that a lot of people don't know that a lot of reports are already out there. So again, when you're setting up Intacct, make sure that you do use the Quick Start program. What we recommend in the construction industry is to use the service one, which gives you a lot of reports out in the system. So make sure you click on the Quick Start library. So again, going into Intacct here, if I go into my financial reports, I'm just going to say leave that because I'm not going to save that. You can go up top here, and if you don't have this on, that means you have not selected a Quick Start program yet underneath your company code. But if you click on the Quick Start library, this gives you a list of 30 reports based upon this Quick Start program that will let you bring in that information. So what you do is you click on the install program, and that information is going to be right there waiting for you to create these reports. So again, a lot of people say, well, Intacct doesn't give me a lot of reports out of the system. They actually do. You just have to make sure you install them at that point. And again, if you install them, there's no harm. If you don't like them, you could simply delete them, or you're going to see in tip number 7, the permissions aspect, and we'll talk about that as we get further down the line. Also, one other thing on here is that remember that the financial reports are not just simply restricted to balance sheet, income statement, and cash flows, but they also could be used for like profitability by job. They can also pull dimensional information in the system. So if you wanted your financial report to be based upon customers, vendors, or most importantly, jobs, you can pull that information for job profitability reports and things like that. Next tip, don't modify the reports that work, duplicate them. One of the biggest mistakes we see in today's world is that people will go in and make a change to the report, and it all of a sudden stops working, and they freak out because they can't remember the change they made, or they change it back and it still doesn't work. So instead of changing an existing report, modify it, call it version 2, and then make the other report inactive. So what I mean by that is that let's go back into Intacct at this point here, and we're going to go back. I'm going to just say done at this point here. So if I have a report that I love at this point here, and I'm going to choose one of my favorite ones, like my profitability, my project overview report here. If I click on edit at this point here, one of the first things you can do is click on this little duplicate button up here, and it will give me a new report name, and it will bring that information in. I can make the changes that I want, and then when I'm all said and done, again, I could make the other report, remove it from the menu, I can make it inactive, or I can remove the permissions on it for people to run it and make this one then the version. That way too, if I made a mistake, they can always go back to the old version of the report. So much easier way of taking care of your reports. The next thing is columns. So there are a lot you could do with columns, and people don't really realize this. First of all, you can move columns around by clicking on the top arrows. It's the easy way of moving things from one area to the next. You can get a lot of information from the column types, which I'll show you in a minute, but you can also set up for example, restrictions based upon different reporting books. And you can also set up restrictions based upon certain dimensions within there. So let's take a look at this a little bit further. So for example, let me say cancel here. And if I look at my job profitability here, and let's just run this one just so we can take a look at this one here out of the box. And I'm going to just say, okay. You'll see that this has the jobs simply going down the left side, which is perfect. You also have a project profitability. Let's take a look at this one. This one I think is the one I was also looking for here. And if I say okay, you'll see that what they've done is that they have each of the projects going across the top. So here we have it on the left side. This way we have them going across the top. And the way they do this is by the use of columns. So if I go into my project profitability, which I'm going to hit the edit button at this point here, and I go to my columns, what you'll see is that, for example, we don't have a lot of columns defined. You don't have to go in and create one by one, but underneath here, what it's doing is that it's using the actual amounts. So we can come in here. Actually, let me take this one step back here. You'll see that we are actually using our account. We're not using Java, we're using our accounts dimension. But when I look at our columns here, I'm saying pull the actual amounts, but then what we're doing is that we're expanding this by the jobs, and it's showing me all levels with roll up. So what it's doing is looking at that dimension there, and it's showing me all the different levels we have of our projects here, and it's rolling them up at that point. This is this allows you to do a lot of stuff within the system here. In addition to that, we also have different types of books. So for example, in the construction module, it wouldn't be uncommon to have actuals where our actual expenses are done, but then we can also, for example, where we can enter things like contracts, we can enter in the contracts in there, and that's the way we can see what our estimated revenue is, or our budgets, versus our actual numbers, and we can do calculations based upon that. So again, other things you could do with the columns is that you can actually make them computations based upon actual or summary of other columns. So I could actually have one column being subtracted from another, or I can add two columns together, things like that. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with the columns. And again, this little drop down up top here allows you to move them to the left or to the right. The other thing that I always tell people to do is don't click on remove, because again, it might be really good. What you can also do is you can also hide those from not showing in the hide that column. So you can actually hide that column instead. So there's ways of doing that within the system. Perfect. We'll go back to our presentation here. Next, tip number 5, be careful with all the prompts. So when you run a report, and let's just go back into our system again. When we run a report, for example, and when you're in here, you can set up different prompts. If I say preview the HTML here, and I love doing this. This makes it really simple where I can run the reports in this version right here. When you run it this way, it doesn't do it, but when you run them, the normal way, I made a mistake there. Now I got sidetracked there. But when I run my reports, you'll notice that it does pop up, for example, the information for the prompts there. The more information you have in prompts, like for example, the more information that you would put in there for the job number, or for the vendor or employees, things like that, you could actually end up filtering the data a lot more than you want to. Just keep in mind that when you're posting to Intacct, everything gets posted in detail at the detail level. So every transaction usually will have a job. In this case, it will have a job information, a customer, a vendor, an employee, an item, a cost code, and cost types if you're using the construction modules. Those are really important to make sure that that if you're filtering too much information or prompting upon too much information, you might not get all the entries. So the balance that comes across in your income statement or your balance sheet might not reflect the right total balance of that GL account. So I always tell people, be careful again on the filters. This is something that I recommend setting up very near the end of the report. Make sure that your report ties out based upon the date, and then start putting filters to make sure that it's easy, that the numbers are exactly the way you want them to be. Number 6, report formatting. So one of the things that people really struggle with is making sure all the reports look the same. Sometimes you can always tell that report that was done by one person versus another person. So what we always recommend is that under the report formatting area, one of the features that was added was the ability to copy the formatting from an existing report. Always start with a template. So for example, if you have one report that's always your template for every other one, come in here, and if it's like, for example, your balance sheet or your income statement, make that, all you do is you bring that in and you say copy formatting, and it will make sure the numbers are in the same way, make sure that the dimension names are the same, the page setups, the totals, all that stuff, the same font. So it makes it a lot easier. So again, have one that's really your template moving forward for report formatting. It makes it a lot easier. And last but not least, in terms of our tips and tricks here, is permissions. Now, there's two parts to this permission aspect. One is that don't give permission to the reports to everyone until the report's 100% ready. I've seen too many times people put the report on the menu and it's not ready yet, and then people start running it and it's not accurate. So when you're creating the report the very first time, under permissions, what you might want to do is just make, as the owner, you can run it, or just give yourself permissions to run it. And at that, once it's ready, then give permissions to the people, to the users and or groups within your organization. Now, one other thing to keep in mind here is that when we set up these permissions, you might give them permissions here, but you still need to give them permission to run the financial statements. So there's two steps here. The first step is, this is the second step of actually giving them permission to this actual financial report. But within Intacct, one of the other things you have to do is that if you go to company and you go to the admin and you go to your roles, for example, and you choose your role, if you choose your role, and you go to the general ledger, you can restrict down, can they run the financial statements, the financials in the first place. So this is very important to make sure that they have permission here, as well as then permission on the individual reports. Now, last but not least, in terms of permissions here, I'm logged in as the administrator. I do not recommend giving people, most users, the ability to delete things like this. This is very dangerous. So it's good to maybe say, okay, list, view, add, or edit, but they should not be able to delete those reports. That's one that usually, if we're not an administrator, we do not recommend having that checked. So again, your security is very important. If you do have any questions on security setup, we'll be happy to review your security for you. Our team can look at that and go through the different settings and recommendations of what needs to be set up, and if we see anything that's set up too lenient or that are things that are not in our best practices. Any questions so far before I go into a few other things and reports? Any questions that have come in so far? So The last thing to really go into is that, again, let's just kind of go through the beginnings of a report setup here. So what I'm going to do here is go into to the general ledger. And again, if you don't see everything on your menus, that usually means that you don't have the permissions to do that. So I'm going to go into my financial reports. Again, if I hit the little plus sign, it will let me create one right then and there, or I can do my financial reports. Again, when you're creating one, what I'm going to do is simply just click on, and I'm going to take you step by step through one report all the way through. So I'm going to take my balance sheet detail right here. And so a couple last things to really kind of point out here. So for example, this report is active. So this is, again, if you don't want to report that, if you don't want to report anymore, you can mark it as inactive. Again, the use of dimensions here allows you to choose that, or you can run this report based upon the account numbers, or you're going to base it upon the actual dimensions within your system: customers, vendors, job types, cost code, things like that. Within the rows, this is really important. This is where you start adding in the hierarchy and the rows that that are coming in here. A couple things to keep in mind. So for example, this is like, for example, you can say select which ones you want to add in here, and it will automatically add them to the report. So if you're trying to add, for example, an account group, like for example, an entire range, you can do multi, you can bring in the ones you want in here, and then just simply hit the include that in the report, and it will put them in the right area. You'll see that we chose, for example, assets and liabilities and equity. So what it did was, by choosing that top level there, it brought in all the information below it. If I would have just chose current assets, it would have brought just that one in. And if I would have chosen just, like, for example, cash equivalents, it would have just brought that line in. So again, when you select the group there, you can go further by saying, for example, give me all my income ones, or income statement ones, or income-based reports, or sorry, revenue ones. Sorry, I keep on saying the wrong word there. I can do my revenue, or I can get very granular in terms of my account groups. The other last thing here is that if you don't want it to show the detail, especially if you're hitting reports like payroll, make sure that you turn these on to summary. So people can't see information or drill down into that information. So again, I always recommend certain aspects hiding the details from certain types of GL accounts, especially, again, payroll accounts and things like that. You can always turn these on to like auto display and basis amount. Like for example, this is for the accumulated percentages, like how, for example, how much revenue, how much expenses did you spend in relationship to revenue. We have our columns that we went over again, and in this example of report here, what you'll see is that we've got multiple columns here. So we've got our account name and number, we've got our actuals here, we've got our current month, 1 month prior, 2 months prior. So if you were going to do a trend report, you would not be uncommon to have multiple columns out here. And again, one of the neat things about Intacct is that you can have you really don't have any true limit up to the number of columns in there. Computations, you can set up different computations within the system. That gets into the training aspect. And then again, we talked about filters, formats, and permissions. Once you're ready to publish these reports here, so it's kind of takes you through that wizard aspect. You can always preview the report. You can always see the view, the audit detail, of what changes you made. But then last but not least, once you mark this as report is active, once you say save and done, it's going to be added to your reports. You can also add this to your favorites if you want to. And the last thing that I would point out is that any report can be added to your dashboards. So when you log into Intacct, Sage Intacct, if your report looks like, if it looks like this, it's time to really pretty it up. And one of our next training sessions, again in November, is that we're going to be going over dashboards and showing you how to create dashboards. So for example, if I wanted to go to my dashboards here, and if I wanted to look at my, we'll just take a financial ratios overview here. That's not a great one. I wanted to do my project performance here. You can start getting this information here, but one of the things you'll see very quickly is that this project overview, as well as my project profitability, These are simply financial statement reports, and you can go ahead and edit them here, or you can, but they will be part of your dashboards. So one of the things that we'll be happy to show you as time goes on is how to get your dashboards to look like what you want to do when you first log in the morning. So with that, I've been speaking for about 25 minutes here. I wanted to see if there was any other questions people had for today. Very quiet group today. Even though we have a large audience, we have a very quiet group. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining today's webinar. We will be holding more of these on a continued basis. So if you have any type of training that you want to have done, please let us know. Next month, again, we're doing one on dashboards and list views. And the following month in December, we're going to be doing it on 1099s. So we'll be going over, again, making sure that you're ready for the end of the year processing with 1099s within Sage Intacct. If you guys need anything, I'll definitely be happy to stay on the line for a few more minutes. Otherwise, I wish everyone a great day and appreciate you spending some time with us here at ETHOSystems. Take care.